The night was colder than usual, the kind of cold that bites through layers and makes even the stars seem distant. The small countryside train station sat nearly empty, a forgotten outpost surrounded by endless white snow. A single street lamp flickered near the platform, painting long shadows across the frozen ground. Chuck Norris stood there, hands tucked in the pockets of his worn leather coat. He had just left a charity event in town, one he attended quietly, without cameras or bodyguards. Despite being a millionaire, a movie legend, and a ranch owner, Chuck still preferred simple places where people treated him like a man, not a myth. He glanced at his watch. The last train was running late. The wind howled through the station, carrying flakes of snow that landed softly on his hat. That's when he saw her. On the far end of the platform sat a young woman. Her thin hospital scrubs peeked out from beneath an oversized coat, clearly borrowed from someone else. Her hair was tied back loosely, and her hands trembled as she rubbed them together for warmth. Beside her sat a small medical bag, worn, patched, and heavy with purpose. Chuck watched for a moment, his instincts sharp as ever. Something about her posture told him she wasn't just waiting for a train, she was waiting for help. He walked closer, his boots crunching softly on the snow. The woman looked up, startled. Up close, Chuck could see her eyes, tired, kind, but full of worry. "Ma'am," he said gently, tipping his hat. "You all right?" She hesitated before answering, her voice shaking slightly. "I'm fine. Just missed my train. Another one doesn't come until morning." Chuck frowned. "It's freezing out here. You got somewhere to stay?" She shook her head. "No, sir. The hotels are full because of the storm. I'll be fine here till morning." He could see her lips turning blue, her breath fogging in the air. She was clearly anything but fine. Chuck took off his heavy coat and held it out. "Here, take this." "Oh, no," she said quickly, waving her hands. "You'll get cold," he smiled softly. "I've handled colder nights than this, ma'am. Besides, I'm not the one shivering." Reluctantly, she accepted it, wrapping the coat around her shoulders. Her face softened as the warmth began to seep in. "Thank you," she whispered. "You didn't have to," Chuck shrugged. "I reckon kindness is like heat. The more you share, the warmer everyone gets." That made her smile for the first time. She looked down, embarrassed. "I'm Emma," she said quietly. "I'm a nurse. I just finished my shift at the county hospital. There was a patient. I stayed longer than I should have, and by the time I got here, my train was gone." Chuck nodded. "You did the right thing. Folks like you keep this world turning." Emma's eyes glistened. No one had said that to her before. For a moment, silence fell between them, broken only by the distant rumble of the wind. Chuck looked toward the dark tracks, then back at the young woman wrapped in his coat. He could have walked away. He could have waited in the warm VIP lounge inside, but something deep in his gut, told him that tonight wasn't a coincidence. Sometimes, fate doesn't shout, it whispers, and that whisper led Chuck Norris to a freezing nurse who was about to change his life forever. But Chuck had no idea this simple act of kindness would soon turn into one of the most extraordinary love stories history had ever seen. The cold wind howled through the empty train station, carrying the scent of snow and iron. Chuck stood beside Emma, his coat now draped over her shoulders. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't awkward, it was heavy, meaningful, as if both of them sensed there was more to this meeting than chance. Chuck glanced at her hands. They were red and raw from the cold. He offered her his gloves. She smiled shyly, hesitating again. "You're too kind, mister." He grinned. "Just Chuck." Her eyes widened a little. "Chuck Norris?" He chuckled softly. "Guilty as charged. But tonight I'm just a guy waiting for a train." Emma laughed quietly, shaking her head. "I've seen your movies. My brothers used to copy your roundhouse kicks." "Well," Chuck said, "tell them to keep practicing. You never know when a little courage might come in handy." The train station door creaked as a gust of wind swept through, rattling the posters on the wall. Chuck gestured toward the small waiting room. "Come on, let's get you somewhere warmer." Inside, a single heater hummed weakly. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead. They sat across from each other on old wooden benches. "So," Chuck said, "you mentioned you're a nurse. Tough job?" Emma nodded slowly. "The toughest." But it's what I love. My mom was a nurse before she got sick. I guess I followed in her footsteps. He leaned forward, his tone soft. She'd be proud of you. Emma smiled faintly. I hope so. She's been in and out of the hospital lately. I've been working extra shifts to cover her treatment. Chuck felt a pang in his chest. He knew what it meant to sacrifice for family. He had lived that kind of loyalty his entire life, on and off screen. You stayed late for a patient, didn't you? He asked. She nodded. An old man with pneumonia. He was scared to be alone and his family lived states away. I couldn't just leave him. He smiled softly. That's what makes heroes, doing the right thing even when no one's watching. Emma looked down, humbled. Most days it doesn't feel heroic, just exhausting. Chuck nodded. The hardest fights don't happen in the ring. They happen right here. He tapped his chest. Inside. Outside, the wind grew louder. The digital board blinked. Train delayed due to storm. Emma sighed. Great, that means another 3 hours. Chuck stood and stretched. 3 hours? Then we'd better find a way to pass the time. He walked to the vending machine, bought 2 cups of lukewarm coffee and handed her one. Not exactly cowboy coffee, but it'll do. She laughed quietly, taking a sip. Thank you. Again, he waved it off. Just paying my dues. You've probably helped more people in a week than I have all year. Emma tilted her head. You've helped plenty. People look up to you, Chuck chuckled. Maybe. But fame doesn't warm hearts like kindness does. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them. It wasn't romance yet. It was recognition. 2 souls shaped by struggle, colliding in the cold. Have you ever met someone completely by accident, but they ended up changing your life forever? Tell me in the comments, and let me know which country and city you're watching from right now. The clock struck midnight. The heater buzzed, barely keeping up against the chill creeping through the cracks. Chuck noticed Emma rubbing her shoulder where the cold had bitten through. He stood, took off his scarf and wrapped it gently around her neck. You don't have to keep giving me your things, she whispered. He smiled. It's not about giving, it's about sharing. Besides, cowboys always look out for those in need. Her eyes softened. You really live by that, don't you? I try. Money and fame don't mean much if you can't use them to help someone. Emma looked down at her cup. You know, most people don't stop. They see someone struggling and just walk by. Chuck's voice lowered. Yeah, but sometimes the smallest act and even a warm coat can change the course of a person's life. Her eyes lifted to meet his again. Do you really believe that? He nodded. I've lived it. Minutes turned into an hour. They shared stories about Chuck's ranch and the horses he raised, about Emma's patience and her dream to open a small clinic someday. The conversation felt effortless, like they'd known each other for years. At one point, she asked softly, Why were you at the station this late? Chuck smiled. I was headed home from a fundraiser for orphaned kids, but I'm starting to think I missed that train for a reason. Emma's brow furrowed. What reason? He shrugged. Maybe to meet someone who reminds me what kindness really looks like. Her lips parted slightly. Taken aback, no one had ever said something like that to her. At least, not with such sincerity. She turned her gaze toward the snowy platform outside, her breath fogging the glass. Funny, she whispered. I thought tonight was one of the worst nights of my life. But now, she looked back at him, smiling softly. Maybe not, Chuck smiled back. Storms have a way of bringing people together. Outside, the snow began to fall heavier. The sound of distant thunder echoed across the tracks. Chuck glanced toward the window. Looks like we might be stuck here a while. Emma nodded. Then maybe that's not such a bad thing. And for the first time that night, the station didn't feel so cold anymore. The warmth wasn't from the heater. It came from something else entirely. A spark. A connection. A story that was just beginning. As the storm raged outside, Chuck and Emma's bond deepened, but neither of them knew that before sunrise. One moment would test everything they believed about kindness, fate, and love. The storm outside refused to end. Snow lashed against the station windows like tiny white knives, painting the night in silver streaks. Inside, the heater sputtered weakly, but Emma and Chuck hardly noticed anymore. They'd spent the last hour talking about everything and nothing. Life, loss, courage, faith. Emma's laugh had softened the silence, and Chuck's calm presence had steadied her fears. But as dawn began to creep through the frosted glass, reality returned, along with the cold truth that soon they'd go separate ways. Chuck stretched his arms, glancing at the train schedule flickering on the wall. Looks like they finally cleared the tracks. The 6:15's on its way. Emma gave a faint smile. Guess that's my ride, he nodded, though something in him tightened. He'd faced villains, danger, and chaos, but nothing felt as heavy as the idea of letting her walk away. The announcement echoed through the station. Train to Dallas arriving in 5 minutes. Emma stood and brushed the wrinkles from her coat. His coat. She hesitated before taking it off. You'll probably need this back. Chuck shook his head. Keep it, consider it a loan until we meet again. She smiled. You sound sure we will, he grinned. Cowboys always keep their promises. Emma bit her lip, her eyes glistening. Then I'll hold you to that. The sound of the train grew louder, the whistle cutting through the cold air. They walked together toward the platform, the snow crunching beneath their boots. Just as Emma stepped toward the train, a man in a heavy coat stumbled through the entrance, gasping for breath. Is there a doctor here? Please, someone help. Emma froze. Instinct kicked in. She rushed toward him. What happened? My wife, she collapsed in the car. She's not breathing. Without hesitation, Emma dropped her bag and sprinted outside. Chuck followed, his heart pounding. There, inside an old pickup truck parked near the tracks, a woman lay unconscious. Emma jumped into action, checking for a pulse. She's gone into cardiac arrest. I need something flat to start compressions. Chuck didn't hesitate. He tore off his jacket, spread it across the truck seat, and helped lay the woman down. Emma's voice was steady but urgent. 30 compressions. 2 breaths, repeat. Chuck followed her lead, counting out loud as she performed CPR. The minutes dragged like hours. The snow kept falling. Every second mattered. Then, a faint gasp. The woman's chest rose weakly. She's breathing, Emma whispered, relief flooding her face. The man broke down in tears, clutching his wife's hand. Thank you so much. Emma smiled faintly, her eyes wet. She'll be okay. Just keep her warm until help arrives. Chuck looked at Emma, her hands shaking, her cheeks flushed from the cold, her heart wide open. She wasn't just a nurse. She was a fighter, a guardian, a hero. Minutes later, an ambulance arrived, its red lights flashing across the snow. Paramedics rushed the woman inside. The grateful husband turned to Emma. You saved her life. Emma smiled softly. I just did my job. Chuck placed a hand on her shoulder. No, Emma, you did more than that. You saved a family. The train whistle blew again, long and low. The conductor called out, Last call for Dallas. Emma turned toward the platform, torn between duty and destiny. I should go, she said quietly. Chuck nodded. Go take care of your mom. She needs you. Emma looked down, hesitating. I wish we had more time, he smiled. Time's funny. The good moments always feel too short, but they stay with you longer than you think. She stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. Thank you, Chuck, for everything. He tipped his hat slightly. Anytime, Nurse Emma. Their eyes locked, a silent promise passing between them. No words, no grand gestures, and just something pure and real. Then, with one last look, she turned and stepped onto the train. Chuck watched as it pulled away, the morning sun breaking through the clouds. For the first time in hours, the storm had stopped. He stood there for a long moment, the silence of the empty station wrapping around him. Then, from the corner of his eye, he noticed something glinting in the snow. It was Emma's silver locket and the one she'd worn all night. He picked it up gently. Inside was a tiny photo, Emma and an older woman in a hospital bed, both smiling. He smiled softly. Guess fate just gave me a reason to see you again. If you were in Chuck's place, would you try to find her again? Or would you let fate decide? Tell me in the comments, and don't forget to drop your country and city below. Chuck turned toward the horizon, where the rising sun painted the snow gold. He tucked the locket safely into his coat pocket and walked toward his truck. The radio crackled to life as he started the engine. Soft country song played, one about love found in the most unexpected places. As the road stretched out before him, Chuck smiled. Looks like this cowboy's got one more story to finish, and with that, he drove off into the sunrise, carrying with him the warmth of a stranger's kindness and the beginning of a love story that history would never forget. Weeks later, when fate finally brought them face to face again, neither of them could have imagined how that meeting would change both their lives forever. 2 weeks had passed since that stormy night at the train station. The snow had melted. The skies had cleared, but Chuck Norris couldn't shake the memory of the nurse with kind eyes and trembling hands. Every morning, while feeding his horses at the ranch, he'd catch himself looking at the horizon, half expecting to see her walking through the gate. Every night, he'd find her silver locket sitting on his desk, a quiet reminder of the warmth she brought into that freezing night. He'd searched the hospital records in Dallas, hoping to find Emma the nurse, but there were dozens of Emmas, none matched. Still, something in his gut told him their story wasn't over. Then one afternoon, while attending a charity event at a local children's hospital, fate decided it was time. Chuck had been invited to donate medical equipment through his foundation. He walked through the pediatric ward, tipping his hat to nurses and waving to the kids who shouted his name. Then, he froze. At the far end of the hallway, beside a small child's bed, stood a woman in light blue scrubs. Her hair was tied the same way, her presence and calm, warm. Unmistakable, it was her Emma. For a moment, Chuck just stood there, watching her from a distance. She hadn't seen him yet. She was too busy comforting a sick little boy who refused to take his medicine. "Come on, champ," she said gently. "If you drink this, you'll get strong enough to meet a real cowboy someday." The boy pouted. "Real cowboys aren't scared of medicine," Emma laughed. "Exactly. So let's prove you're braver than one." That's when Chuck stepped forward, his voice calm but playful. "Well now, I'd have to disagree with that, ma'am." Emma turned, startled, and then froze completely. Her eyes widened, disbelief flooding her face. "Chuck?" He grinned. "That's me. Unless you've met another cowboy who loans his coat to freezing nurses." She blinked, half laughing, half speechless. "I don't believe this," Chuck nodded. "Neither did I, but I told you, cowboys keep their promises." The boy giggled. "You're Chuck Norris." Chuck smiled, kneeling down beside him. "That's right, partner. And this lady here is tougher than any cowboy I've ever met." Emma's cheeks flushed. "Oh, stop it," he looked up at her. "Not a chance." Later that day, after Chuck finished greeting patients, Emma found him outside near the hospital garden. The winter air was softer now, the sun warm on their faces. "I never got to thank you," she said quietly, "for staying that night, for everything." Chuck smiled. "You don't need to thank me. I just did what anyone would have done." She shook her head. "No, most people would have walked by. You stayed. You cared. That night, it reminded me why I became a nurse in the first place." He looked at her for a long moment. "And you reminded me why kindness still matters." Silence hung between them. Comfortable, meaningful. Then, with a small smile, Chuck reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something silver. "Think this belongs to you." Emma gasped softly. "My locket. I thought I lost it." He handed it over. "Found it in the snow after you left. Been keeping it safe." She opened it, smiling down at the photo inside, her and her mother. "She passed away last year," Emma said softly. "This is the only picture I have of us together." Chuck nodded respectfully. "She'd be proud. You've got her strength." Tears welled in her eyes, but she smiled through them. "You always know what to say, don't you?" He chuckled. "Only when it matters." They sat on a bench as the evening breeze rustled through the garden. Chuck told her about his ranch, his horses, his foundation work. Emma shared stories from the hospital, long shifts, funny patients, the moments that made it all worth it. They talked for hours, not as a celebrity and a nurse, not as a cowboy and a stranger, but as two souls who had found something rare, understanding. When the sun dipped below the horizon, Emma stood reluctantly. "I should get back to work." Chuck nodded. "Duty calls," she smiled. "You know, I still have your coat," he grinned. "I know. I wasn't planning on asking for it back." "Then maybe," she said, tilting her head, "you'll have to come get it yourself." Chuck chuckled softly. "Careful, ma'am. Cowboys take invitations seriously." She laughed, the same laugh that had melted the cold that night. As she walked away, Chuck watched her disappear into the hospital. For the first time in years, he felt something stir deep inside, hope. He looked toward the darkening sky, the stars just beginning to appear. Maybe fate doesn't need directions. Maybe it just needs a good heart and a reason. Chuck smiled to himself. Guess I just found mine. Do you believe in fate, or do you think love happens by choice? Comment your thoughts below and tell me where you're watching this story from. But what neither of them knew was that this reunion was only the beginning, because just when love started to bloom, life would throw them both a test that would make their bond legendary. Weeks passed, and the friendship between Chuck Norris and Emma grew into something neither of them expected. Something quiet but powerful. They spoke almost every day, sometimes at the hospital cafe, other times over late-night phone calls when Emma finished her shift. Chuck admired her strength. Emma admired his humility. Together, they found peace in a world that often felt too noisy. It wasn't about fame or wealth, it was about connection, the kind that doesn't need words to feel real. One evening, Chuck drove down to the city to surprise Emma after work. He parked outside the hospital, bouquet in hand and simple daisies, her favorite. As he waited by the entrance, a sudden commotion broke out near the ER doors. Paramedics rushed in with stretchers, shouting orders, multiple injuries, highway pileup. We need all available hands. Emma's voice echoed through the chaos. Get me saline and call the trauma surgeon now. Chuck froze. She was already there, her scrubs stained, her hair tied tight, her eyes focused. He watched as she took command of the emergency room like a warrior on a battlefield. Minutes turned into hours. Chuck waited outside quietly, watching through the glass. Finally, the last patient was stabilized. Emma leaned against the wall, exhausted. Her hands were shaking, but her spirit wasn't. Chuck walked in softly, setting the flowers beside her. You okay, Nurse Emma? She looked up, surprised, then smiled faintly. I was about to ask you the same thing, he chuckled. You saved them all, didn't you? She sighed. Not all. But I tried, he nodded gently. That's what heroes do. As they stepped outside together, the first drops of rain began to fall. Light at first, then heavier. Chuck opened his coat and held it over her head. Seems like every time we meet, the weather's got drama. Emma laughed softly. Maybe it's trying to tell us something. He looked at her, the rain glistening in her hair. Yeah, that the best things in life don't come easy. They stood there for a moment, silent, soaked, and smiling. It was one of those moments you wish you could freeze forever. But fate, once again, had other plans. A few days later, Chuck got a call. He was out at his ranch, helping one of his workers fix a fence when his phone buzzed. Mr. Norris? Came a voice he didn't recognize. This is St. Luke's Hospital. I'm calling about Emma Carter. His heart stopped. What happened? She collapsed during her shift. We're running tests now, but it looks like pneumonia. It's serious. Chuck didn't wait to hear more. He dropped everything, jumped in his truck, and sped toward the hospital. The drive felt endless. Every red light, every turn. Rain pounded the windshield as thunder rolled across the sky. Just like that night at the station, when he finally arrived, he rushed through the hallways until he found her room. There she was, pale, weak, oxygen mask on her face. The strong nurse who once braved the cold was now fighting her own storm. Chuck sat beside her, gently taking her hand. Hey, partner, he whispered. You weren't supposed to scare me like that. Her eyes fluttered open. She smiled faintly beneath the mask. Guess I needed a cowboy to rescue me this time. He chuckled softly, holding back tears. Always, Emma. Always. Days passed. Chuck never left her side. He brought soup from his ranch, read to her, even played her favorite country songs on his phone. Slowly, she began to recover, her spirit too stubborn to quit. The doctors said her body responded faster than expected. One even joked, "She's got the heart of a fighter." Chuck smiled proudly. Told you, she's the toughest nurse I know. When Emma was finally well enough to walk, they took a stroll in the hospital garden. The air was fresh after the storm, the sun soft and golden. I thought I lost you, Chuck said quietly. Emma looked at him. You can't lose someone who was meant to stay. He smiled, eyes soft. You still believe in fate? She nodded. Now more than ever. He took her hand gently. Then maybe fate's been right all along. She blushed, her eyes glistening. What do you mean? Chuck took a deep breath. Emma, I've lived through fame, battles, and storms, but none of it felt as real as sitting here with you. Her eyes widened, heart pounding. He smiled softly. I don't know what tomorrow holds, but I know I don't want to face it without you. Emma's tears spilled over and she whispered, Then don't. They stood there as the sunlight broke through the clouds, warm, golden, full of promise. It wasn't dramatic or grand, it was simple, quiet, and true. The kind of love story that doesn't need words, only a heartbeat. Would you stand by someone through their darkest days like Chuck did? Tell me your thoughts, and comment your city and country below to join this global family of storytellers. But destiny wasn't done yet, because what happened next would turn their quiet love into a story that inspired millions, a story that made history. Spring had just arrived in Texas. The fields near Chuck Norris's ranch were covered in wildflowers, and the air carried the scent of new beginnings. Emma had fully recovered and was stronger than ever, though she'd often laugh about how Chuck still refused to let her lift anything heavier than a teacup. Every morning, she'd visit the ranch, sometimes helping with the horses, sometimes just sitting on the porch while Chuck told stories from his old movie days. To her, he wasn't the action legend the world adored. He was the kind man who'd once given his coat to a freezing stranger. They didn't call what they had love. They didn't have to. It showed in the way he'd pour her coffee before his own, or the way she'd stay up late just to make sure he rested after long charity trips. It was simple, real, pure. One evening, they attended a fundraiser for veterans, one of Chuck's biggest causes. Emma had been invited as a volunteer nurse, helping with the medical checkups. Chuck, as usual, tried to keep a low profile, preferring to blend in with the crowd, but when Emma arrived, wearing a simple blue dress and that silver locket he'd returned, the entire room seemed to pause. Even Chuck, the man who had stared down danger countless times, found himself speechless. Wow, he whispered. You sure you're not trying to steal the show? She smiled. I thought you liked a little competition, cowboy. He laughed softly. Not when I've already lost. The night went beautifully. Speeches, donations, laughter, and music, until a sudden shout broke the calm. Someone's down. We need a medic. The crowd turned to see an elderly veteran collapse near the stage. Before anyone could react, Emma sprinted forward, pushing through the crowd. She knelt beside the man, checking his pulse, her voice calm and clear. I need oxygen now, and a pulse oximeter, quick. Chuck grabbed the medical bag from the nearby table and handed it to her without a word. She worked fast, focused, professional. The crowd watched in silence as Emma stabilized the veteran. Minutes later, the man opened his eyes weakly. Applause erupted across the hall. The cameras that had been recording the event swung toward them, capturing the moment. The teamwork, the calm under pressure. One reporter whispered, That's Chuck Norris helping a nurse save a veteran. By morning, the photo had gone viral. Headlines exploded worldwide. Chuck Norris, an unknown nurse save veteran at charity gala. The millionaire cowboy and the heroic nurse. A love story in action. At first, Chuck ignored it. Fame didn't matter to him anymore. But when he saw the way the story inspired people, messages from nurses, soldiers, and ordinary folks saying how their act gave them hope, he realized this was bigger than them. One post read, In a world full of ego, this story reminds us what real strength looks like, compassion. Another said, They didn't do it for attention. They did it because that's who they are. Emma was overwhelmed. I never wanted to be in the spotlight, she told Chuck. I just did what anyone would have done. Chuck smiled. That's why the world loves you. Because anyone didn't do it, you did. Soon, media outlets began calling. Talk shows, newspapers, podcasts. Everyone wanted the story. Chuck agreed to one interview, on the condition that it focused on her, not him. On camera, he sat beside Emma, his hand gently resting over hers. The interviewer asked, Mr. Norris, what made you help that night at the station? And again at the gala? Chuck thought for a moment before replying. Because when you see someone in need, you don't ask who they are, you ask what they need. The world would be a better place if more people thought like her. He turned to Emma. She reminded me that kindness still wins. Emma traced the words with her fingers. You think we deserve this? Chuck smiled softly. No, but I think kindness does. She leaned her head against his shoulder. You ever wonder why fate picked us? He looked at the horizon. Maybe to remind the world that love doesn't need perfection, just purpose. Do you believe one small act of kindness can change the world? Type yes if you do, and tell me your city and country below to spread this message of love and hope. But the story didn't end there, because what came next would make Chuck and Emma's love immortal, turning it into a legend that history would never forget. Years passed, the world changed, cities grew, faces aged and stories faded, but one story never did. The story of a millionaire, cowboy and a freezing nurse at a train station. A story that began with a simple act of kindness and ended up inspiring millions around the world. Chuck Norris and Emma Carter became more than just names. They became symbols of compassion, humility, and hope. After their story went viral, they continued living quietly on Chuck's ranch. Reporters still tried to visit, but Chuck always said the same thing. Some stories are meant to be told, but not lived in the spotlight. Together, they built something lasting. They founded the Warm Coat Foundation, helping underprivileged hospitals and homeless shelters across America. Every winter, thousands of coats were distributed with a small tag stitched inside that read, "Be someone's warm coat," inspired by Chuck and Emma. The message spread far beyond Texas, to Europe, Asia, Africa, reminding people that kindness was not weakness, but the purest form of strength. Years later, when Emma's mother's hospital reopened a new wing, it was named the Carter Norris Healing Center. Chuck attended the ceremony quietly, wearing his old hat and a small smile. Emma stood beside him, holding his hand. "This isn't for us," she said softly. "It's for everyone who believes love can heal." He nodded. "Then we've done something right." As time went on, Chuck's health began to slow, but his spirit never did. Every morning, he still rode his favorite horse across the ranch, while Emma watched from the porch with a cup of coffee. One day, as the sun rose, he dismounted and joined her on the steps. "Emma," he said with a gentle smile, "you remember that night at the train station?" She laughed. "How could I forget? You looked like some hero from an old Western movie." He chuckled. "I wasn't a hero, just a man lucky enough to meet the right person at the right time." She squeezed his hand. "And I was just a nurse who needed a miracle." He smiled. "Maybe we both were." That evening, Chuck wrote something in his notebook, the same one he used for his movie scripts and personal reflections. On the first page, he wrote, "Kindness is the only fight worth winning." Chuck Norris. He placed it beside Emma's silver locket on the table. A few months later, the world said goodbye to Chuck Norris, the legend, the fighter, the cowboy. But when the news broke, the world didn't just mourn, it remembered. People everywhere began sharing the story of the freezing nurse and the millionaire cowboy again. Clips, photos, and messages flooded social media, not about his fame, but about their love. Emma, though heartbroken, stood strong at his memorial. She spoke softly but with power. "Chuck taught me that real strength isn't in fists or fame. It's in how gently you hold someone else's heart." The crowd rose in silent respect. Tears fell, not of sorrow, but of gratitude. Months later, Emma returned to that same train station. It looked different now, restored, modern, but one thing remained, the old bench where it all began. She sat down, the wind cool against her face. From her coat pocket, she took out Chuck's notebook and the silver locket. She whispered, "You kept your promise, cowboy. You found me, and you never left." The wind rustled softly, as if answering. She smiled through her tears. Guess fate really does keep its word. As the train pulled into the station, a young nurse walked by, shivering slightly. Without hesitation, Emma stood and handed her scarf over. "Here," she said kindly. "It's cold. You'll need this." The young woman smiled, surprised. "Thank you, ma'am." "You didn't have to." Emma looked at her warmly. "I know. But kindness is like heat, and the more you share, the warmer everyone gets." The young nurse froze for a moment. Those words sounded familiar. Emma smiled faintly, watching the train pull away into the golden horizon. And just like that, the story began again. If you believe that one act of kindness can change a life, type respect in the comments. And remember, legends aren't born in fame. They're made in moments of compassion. Chuck Norris and the Freezing Nurse, the love story that made history.